After failing to escape the world inside the book for the 99th time, I decided to accelerate the plot. In front of the crowd, they humiliated the male protagonist and called the female protagonist to watch. The female protagonist, wanting to save the male protagonist, pointed at me and cursed me as a despicable person. But the male protagonist, with bloodshot eyes, rebuked her, saying, "Get lost." In the midst of her shocked gaze, the male protagonist humbly pleaded with me. "Don't leave me behind, I'll be obedient." Chapter 1. Once again, I failed to escape the world inside the book. I was forcefully pulled back by the strong obsession of the male protagonist. He had been sitting by the bed, guarding my lifeless body without eating or drinking for 3 whole days. In agony, he held his head, his eyes bloodshot, and his whole being in a state of despair. When he noticed that I had awakened, he trembled and reached out his hands, but hesitated to embrace me. His thin lips moved, almost in a submissive tone. He said, "Sister, whether you hit me or scold me, I only beg you not to leave me." Seeing him in such a paranoid and fragile state, I couldn't help but soften my heart. I sighed and said, "I'm hungry, go make me a bowl of tomato and egg noodles." "Okay." Louis stood up in response, but before leaving, he anxiously glanced at me. It seemed as if he was confirming whether I would still be there. After he left, the voice of the system resonated in my mind. "Host, you are still too soft-hearted. If you want to leave here, the male protagonist must completely despise you. You should learn from the original host." I recalled how the original host treated Louis and let out a hesitant sigh. Wouldn't that be too cruel? The system, disappointed, said, "You feel sorry for the male protagonist now, but what about when the female protagonist appears? He is destined to fall in love with her, and the power of the plot is stronger than you can imagine." I lowered my gaze, pondering over the system's words, and silently made a decision. Chapter 2. Louis held a steaming bowl of noodles and presented it to me as if it were a precious treasure. His chin rested on his arm, and he stared at me without blinking, separated by a thin layer of steam. It was as if he was afraid that if he looked away for a moment, I would disappear. Under his hopeful and nervous gaze, I took a sip of the noodles and gave him a thumbs up, saying, "It's delicious." Upon hearing this, Louis lowered his head and shyly smiled. The corners of his eyebrows and eyes were filled with a smile. His clear black eyes seemed to ripple with a gentle wave, clean and bright. My heart and eyes were filled with him. Looking at him, so easily satisfied, my emotions were complex. By a chance encounter, I transmigrated into this book. I became the malicious supporting character who constantly abused the male protagonist. According to the original plot, the male protagonist would find redemption after meeting the female protagonist and grow into a powerful figure with her by his side. His first act of strength would be to seek revenge on the original host. I was terrified. I desperately tried to make amends to the male protagonist, doing my best to treat him well. I hoped that in the future, he would remember our past and spare me. I originally thought I would be trapped in this book forever. But suddenly, the system told me that it had found a way for me to go back home. Every time, I was just one step away from success, only to end in failure. It was because of the male protagonist's strong obsession with me. This world revolved around him and the female protagonist, and the slightest action had far-reaching consequences. In the real world, my parents were still waiting for me. I had to go back. I closed my eyes and silently apologized to Louis in my heart. Chapter 3. In order to better implement the plan, I specifically invited the original host's group of friends. The gathering took place at the most popular upscale venue, the Haute Noble Bar. When John saw Louis following behind me, his face, filled with smiles, turned grim. "Why did you bring him here? What bad luck," he exclaimed. In the past, I would have definitely defended the male protagonist. But today, I imitated the original host's tone, brushed my stray hair behind my ear, and arrogantly replied, "Of course, I brought him to play with as a toy and amuse us." Louis widened his eyes in shock, looking at me with disbelief. On the other hand, John was delighted. "Tina, you've finally come to your senses. How could someone as lowly as him stand with us?" he continued. As soon as these words were spoken, everyone in the room burst into mocking laughter, including me. Louis stood there, at a loss, emitting an aura of loneliness like an abandoned child. Meanwhile, I sat in the center of attention, leaning back on the sofa, with a raised eyebrow, casually tossing a bank card onto the coffee table. With a cool tone, I said, "Louis, your grandmother is critically ill. Didn't you ask me for money last time? As long as you're willing to strip in front of everyone, take off one piece of clothing, and I'll give you 100,000. As soon as the words were spoken, the crowd started applauding and cheering, chanting, "Strip! Strip! Strip!" They harbored wicked tendencies, deriving pleasure from the pain of others. This time, I restrained my soft-heartedness. I completely transformed back into the crazy villain that the male protagonist feared and despised. Leaning forward, I looked at him, my eyes filled with mockery. Chapter 4. Louis stared at me for a while, seeing no signs of me backing down. His trembling fingers reached for the first button on his shirt. It seemed like he was really going to take it off. The female protagonist, who had just burst into the scene, happened to witness this and threw the fruit plate she was holding aside. She rushed over and grabbed Louis' hand, firmly standing in front of him, glaring at me. "You scum, I won't allow you to bully him." At that moment when I saw her, I let out a long sigh. It was precisely because I knew that the female protagonist was working here part-time that I specifically chose this place. I did everything I could to minimize the harm to Louis. I lifted my thin lips, about to mock the female protagonist for her audacity, but suddenly, Louis, who had been quiet and silent, erupted. His eyes turned bloodshot as he shouted angrily, "Get lost!" The female protagonist was frightened, frozen in place and unable to move. Immediately after, the male protagonist, as if going insane, took off his own shirt. Then he rushed over and hugged me. His hands clamped onto me like a vice, almost suffocating me. He buried his head in my embrace and pleaded in a low voice, "Sister, don't abandon me. Don't leave me again. I'll be very obedient." I trembled all over. Chapter 5. He held me tightly. Through that thin layer of fabric, I could clearly feel the warmth and firmness of his body. But most importantly, he was trembling. Shaking all over. Accompanied by his hoarse cries, he seemed to have fallen into an inescapable whirlpool of sadness. At this moment, I sat on the sofa, while Louis half knelt on the ground, burying his face in the crook of my shoulder. He was sobbing in pain. My heart couldn't help but waver. At this critical moment, the system in my mind was screaming frantically. "Host, this is the male protagonist's desperate strategy. A desperate strategy, You must not fail at this crucial moment. Remember, you are someone who wants to go home." Coincidentally, at that moment, the female protagonist Susan, unable to tolerate Louis' begging posture any longer, bit her lip and came over to pull him away. "Don't you have any dignity? We may be poor, but we have our pride. She is simply insulting your character." I narrowed my eyes, forcing myself to suppress that hint of pity. I fully embraced the maliciousness of the original host, slowly prying Louis' hand away. Leaning down, I whispered in his ear, "If you dare to cling to me without knowing your place, I won't go easy on your grandmother." In an instant, the strength that bound me loosened. At the same time, a corner of my heart collapsed. I watched helplessly as the light in Louis' eyes extinguished completely, turning into ashes. He could forsake his dignity for me, disregard life and death, but he couldn't ignore his grandmother. That was his only weakness. Chapter 6. Louis grew up with his grandmother since he was young. The original host was arrogant and bullied Louis, who was an orphan with both parents deceased, often scolding and hitting him. However, the grandmother often remembered the kindness my family had shown her. Louis didn't want his grandmother to worry, so he swallowed all the suffering. Perhaps, for Louis, my arrival was the only guiding light amidst the dense fog. That's why he desperately clung to me, refusing to let go. The system was dedicated to attacking and eliminating any possibility of me developing empathy for the male protagonist. It said, "Don't forget, he still has his own bright future ahead of him. Host, you are ultimately an outsider. If you invest your heart here, when the male protagonist can't resist the power of the plot and falls in love with the female protagonist, how will you cope? In the real world, you're still a comatose vegetable, and as an only child, what will happen to your parents?" These were soul-crushing questions. In an instant, all softness in my heart vanished. Chapter 7. I got up leisurely, casting a disdainful glance at Louis, perfectly embodying the temperament of a malicious supporting female character. All the kindness I showed you before was just an act. I enjoyed seeing the despair in your eyes. So, what's this? You're not actually falling for me, are you? I lowered my head, pinching his chin, and mocked him to the extreme. Stockholm Syndrome? Wow, you're really pathetic. With that, I called John and the others, and we left the noble bar in a grand manner. Before leaving, our group was filled with mocking laughter. Tina, we actually thought you had fallen for that lowly guy. When it comes to playing, you're the best. As the door closed, the smirk on my face faltered. Countless exhaustion overwhelmed me, and John asked me, "Where are we going next to have fun?" Lacking enthusiasm, I shook my head. "I have something to attend to. I'm leaving." "Oh, really?" John and the others were disappointed, trying to convince me to stay. But I wasn't the original host after all. I didn't enjoy being around this chaotic bunch of people. Once I sat in the car, I instructed the driver, "Go to the hospital." Chapter 8. There is a huge floor-to-ceiling window in the private room, facing the hospital garden. There's a rocking chair placed there. Grandmother is lying on the rocking chair, taking a nap, with a hand fan beside her. A gentle smile graces her aged lips, and her face radiates kindness. I tiptoe over, wanting to pick up the hand fan and fan her, but she wakes up. She calls my name with a smiling voice. "Tina is here." That affectionate address almost made me shed tears. I once had a grandmother too. But she went to a distant place and will never come back. I hold back the tears, walk over, and crouch down, resting my head on her lap. Grandmother gently strokes my head, with warmth and love. "Tina, Louis is a good child. After I'm gone, can I entrust you to take care of him more?" "I'm afraid I can't." I lift my gaze, hold grandmother's hand, and say solemnly, "You are the most cherished person in his world. Grandmother, you will live a long and healthy life. You have to witness Louis's success, his marriage, and the birth of his children." Grandmother falls silent. I'm afraid I won't live to see that day. I can't bear to hear such words of separation and farewell. Chapter 9. Just as the driver returned after paying, I bid farewell. Unfortunately, I ran into Louis as I was about to leave. This time, he was accompanied by the female lead. Has fate really brought them together according to the predetermined trajectory? Though I felt a sense of loss in my heart, there was more joy. The moment Louis saw me, his dark eyes flickered. I immediately interrupted his wild thoughts. "We agreed that you would take off one item for 100,000, but you took off two at the bar. Here's 200,000. From now on, we'll go our separate ways." With that, I casually threw the bank card. The card traced an arc in the air. The sharp edge left a small scar on Louis's face. Instead of reaching out to catch it, he let the bank card fall to the ground. Susan was furious with my actions and shouted at my back. "Hey! We may be poor, but you can't just treat us however you want." I ignored her and went straight home. Chapter 10. Exhausted, I collapsed onto the bed and asked the system, "When can I go home?" "It's not time yet," the system replied. I rolled over, burying my face in the pillow that still carried the scent of sunlight, and continued to inquire. "Do we have to treat the male lead in such a cruel way?" The system responded, "Besides making him give up, what other way do you think can eliminate his obsession with you? What about erasing his memories?" The system clicked its tongue and said, "Memories can be erased, but emotions cannot be erased." It seemed like a destined stalemate. Knowing that the end result would only bring harm to both of us, I still had to continue on this path with unwavering determination. Chapter 11. Louis returned when the sky was bright. At that moment, I sat on the couch, wearing a face mask and sipping juice. Louis approached me softly and said, "I took Susan to the hospital because her family runs a traditional Chinese medicine clinic. Maybe it can help with Grandma's illness." I stayed silent. The silence around us was terrifying. Louis lowered his head and after a while, he said, "It didn't mean anything else." I finished my drink with a sigh and gave him a strange glance. "Why are you telling me this? Do you think I care?" Louis suddenly clenched his fists, pressed his lips together, and walked towards the kitchen. I'll make breakfast for you. This time, I didn't stop him. He was a master in the kitchen, and over the years that I've been here, he had spoiled my taste buds. The breakfast places outside couldn't satisfy my appetite. Louis silently watched me finish my meal. When he saw that I didn't say anything disdainful, his broken heart healed a little. Finally, a hint of joy appeared on his face, devoid of any bitterness. I elegantly wiped the corners of my mouth, and he tried to strike up a conversation, but I ignored him. He followed me, step by step. I taunted him, "Are you my pet dog? Can't shake you off no matter how hard I try." Louis forced a smile and said, "I'd rather be your pet dog." I remained silent. How could someone willingly degrade themselves to this extent? If I could turn into candy, at least you wouldn't abandon me. I heard his muttered words, stumbled for a moment, and then hastily fled from the scene. Chapter 12. Candy was a stray dog that Louis brought home. I had just crossed over at that time. He and the previous owner had a terrible relationship. Louis stood in the storm wearing a raincoat. Rainwater trickled down his face, following the strands of his hair and dripping onto the ground. The poor little dog poked its round head out from his arms and let out a pitiful howl. Both Louis and the dog were in a sorry state. "Can I keep it?" he asked me, making his first request. Coincidentally, I was struggling with Louis's deep mistrust towards me and saw this as an opportunity to break through. With a shared interest and love for the dog, our relationship indeed grew closer. We named the dog Candy, hoping for sweetness and happiness. While bathing Candy, I tilted my head and sweetly smiled at Louis, saying, "I hope your future days will be as sweet as honey." For 3 whole years, I watched Candy grow from a tiny pup into a big bundle of joy. That summer, we planned to go out together to walk the dog. Candy ran freely on the lawn, but right before my eyes, it was hit by a car, and blood flowed like a river. It forever remained in that summer, that dusk. Even in its dying moments, it stubbornly looked in the direction where I stood, its eyes wide open. As if questioning, why hasn't its owner come to find it yet? I was shocked, unable to move. It wasn't until Louis came over to me that I realized my whole body was trembling. Confused, I lifted my head and pointed towards Candy not far away, uncertainly asking him, "Is Candy dead?" Without saying a word, Louis simply covered my eyes, not allowing me to continue seeing that vivid red color. Later, we dug a hole together and buried Candy in the yard, a place we could see as soon as we stepped outside. That was my first encounter with the threat of death in this world that I had crossed into through a book. It felt so close, making me tremble with fear. I used to consider everything here as an unattainable dream. I didn't feel a sense of belonging here. Only Candy, whom I raised with my own hands, truly belonged to me. But now, it's gone. Louis saw the deep sorrow hidden within me and made a firm promise. "Tina, I will never leave you. What if one day I want to abandon you? Unless I die." Each word he spoke still echoed in my ears, yet now I have to fulfill that promise. Chapter 13. Louis used to go to school with me in the past. This time, out of habit, he still wanted to sit in the passenger seat, but I reached out to stop him. "Go on, walk by yourself." Louis had a moment of surprise, obediently got out of the car. By the time he arrived, half an hour of class had already passed. He appeared at the classroom door, panting, and shouted, "Report." The teacher who taught us is very good at judging people. Seeing that I didn't accompany Louis this time, he knew that I had grown tired of him. In a cold voice, he said, "Stand outside and listen." Louis lowered his head and obediently went outside to stand as a punishment. After class, a group of people surrounded him, mocking and taunting him. "Louis, weren't you quite arrogant before? Without Tina's protection, who would give you a second glance?" They said all sorts of hurtful words, but Louis remained indifferent. He stood tall and firm, like a crane among chickens. Those people felt their dignity being challenged and started to get physical. In the midst of the pushing and shoving, the protective amulet hanging around Louis's neck fell off. It was something his grandmother had worked hard to obtain for him. He bent down to pick it up, but someone stepped on the back of his hand, causing him to wince in pain, his face turning pale. My best friend couldn't bear it and hesitantly asked, "Tina, are you really not going to care about him anymore?" I was about to get up when, the next moment, Susan ran over from a distance. She pushed through the crowd to protect Louis, protesting, You're not allowed to treat him like this. I stared blankly at the scene outside the window, and the system in my mind said, you see, this is the power of the plot. The female lead always appears at the right moment to become the male lead's savior. With more encounters, he will eventually fall in love with the female lead. Yes, he would eventually fall in love with Susan. When he falls in love with Susan and grows tired of me, I can finally go home. Chapter 14. Noon. After having lunch with my best friend and casually finding a table to sit at, she asked the question that was on her mind, why did you suddenly break up with Louis? Nothing, I just found him unpleasant to look at. I lowered my gaze and silently ate my food. The cafeteria food smelled delicious, but it tasted bland and like wax in my mouth. My best friend sighed helplessly, you've really been spoiled by Louis, haven't you? She knew that Louis took care of all my meals, 3 times a day. My best friend gave me a meaningful look, have you really thought this through? Habits are hard to break. Then use a knife to cut it off, you can always quit. My best friend suddenly fell silent. I didn't know when Louis arrived. He was holding a lunchbox in his hands. His slim, black eyes were tinged with crimson, shimmering with tears, and his face was filled with sorrow. He placed the lunchbox on the table and quickly backed away. I brought you lunch, I just heated it up in the microwave. With those words, he ran away as if escaping. His departing figure was desolate and filled with loneliness. My best friend glanced at him, then at me, and sighed, well, you're the most pitiful dog ever. A lump formed in my throat, and a sourness spread throughout me. Chapter 15. After the meal, Louis found the lunch he had prepared for me in the trash bin. A tinge of sadness appeared on his face as he pulled out a bitter smile. I remained indifferent, my expression cold. Don't do these meaningless things anymore, I don't need them, I said. His face darkened as he lowered his head, his hand clenched into a fist by his side. I thought he had finally reached his limit and was going to break ties with me. But instead, he forced a smile and asked me, is today's food not to your liking? I'll improve it tomorrow. My breath suddenly halted. After taking a deep breath, I spoke with disgust, Louis, don't you understand human language? I dislike you, I'm tired of you. Can't you stop clinging to me like a band-aid? But he just shrugged it off and laughed, I know. His nonchalant attitude left me feeling blocked, unable to utter the words of insults that were stuck in my throat. But I can't live without you, Tina. Losing you is like a fish leaving the water, my life would be meaningless. Can't live without me? How is that possible? No one in this world is someone's one and only. Louis remained unchanged, continuing to do as he pleased. It truly confirmed his words, whether you hit me or curse at me, I only ask that you don't leave me. My plans were repeatedly hindered. The day I could go home seemed distant and uncertain. Chapter 16. A turning point occurred on my birthday. They threw a celebration for me at the Haju bar. I had kept too much bitterness in my heart during this time, and I wanted to release it all. One moment of carelessness, and I ended up getting drunk. I fell onto the couch, tilting my head back and foolishly laughing at the lights above. The once bustling private room suddenly fell silent. A shadow cast over me. A hand traced from my forehead, along the bridge of my nose, lips, and down to my collarbone, gently caressing. Wherever it touched, a shiver ran through me. Instinctively, I felt disgusted. Emerging from the haze, I vaguely recognized the person as John. My heart froze, and I forcefully pushed him away, shouting angrily, "Get lost!" But my body felt weak, unable to muster any strength. John smirked wickedly and said, "Tina, I've desired you for so long, yet you'd rather have a dog by your side than even look at me. Now that you and Louis are done, you're mine." His tone was tainted with a twisted possessiveness. I trembled with anger. John impatiently pressed down on me, wanting to take advantage of me. In my desperation, I called out the name I relied on most in my heart. Louis. Chapter 17. Trembling with fear, my voice carried a hint of trembling. Originally, it was just a wish, but in the next moment, he miraculously appeared before me. He forcefully kicked open the door of the private room, grabbed John by the collar, and delivered a powerful punch to his face. Instantly, his nose started bleeding profusely. John staggered back a few steps, wiping the blood from his face. Enraged, he couldn't contain himself any longer. "You've had enough, how dare you hit me?" Louis, like a wild beast out of control, veins bulging on his neck, his eyes filled with bloodlust, exclaimed, "Who gave you the right to touch Tina?" John coldly sneered, seemingly unfazed. "Our families had plans for a marriage alliance. Sooner or later, she would have been mine. What difference does it make if it happens sooner or later? Scum. Beast." This statement completely enraged Louis. He grabbed John and unleashed a furious onslaught of punches. I tightly wrapped my coat around me, watching Louis go mad, using all his strength with each punch and kick. In the end, I had to shout to stop him, preventing him from killing a man. Chapter 18. Due to this incident, Louis and I had a period of eased tension in our relationship. The system kept urging me, "Hurry up, you're running out of time." I couldn't resist the power of the plot. As the timeline returned to its intended course, the male lead was bound to fall in love with the female lead. And as someone who disrupted the normal plot, I was like an anomaly. The incident with John last time was a warning from fate. It reminded me to follow the plot properly. No longer would I play the role of a vicious supporting character just because I wanted to go home. The system said, high school graduation is the beginning of all plot points. If you delay any longer, you will die. By then, they would inject a new malicious supporting character's soul into this body. There was only 1 month left. Louis was busy for my sake, finding joy in his efforts. What kind of ending would be worthy of his tumultuous journey? I wanted to be the warmth that embraced him, but ultimately, I became the knife that killed him. Louis. I called his name. He put down what he was doing and quietly waited for my command. "Could you go to the school gate and buy me a plate of fried rice noodles? I feel like eating it." This was the first time, since I had unilaterally mistreated him, that I made a request. Louis couldn't contain his joy and set off after putting down what he held. I rolled off the bed. Walking to the window, I saw his figure cycling with a sense of elegance. I exhaled onto the window glass, moving my finger to write "I'm sorry" on it. Chapter 19. This is a crucial plot point. Grandmother is about to pass away. Once she's gone, all of Louis's emotional support will collapse. Preventing him from seeing his grandmother one last time is the only way to make him hate me. The system sighed, "Host, you have finally grown." But as I stepped into my grandmother's hospital room and saw her gentle face, I had a change of heart. How could I be so malicious? I know all too well the pain of not being able to see a loved one for the last time. Can I really go to any lengths just to go back home? I didn't see my grandmother one last time back then. Even if it meant risking my life, I shouldn't have been so cruel. Louis had only just left, so there was still time to call him back. But why couldn't I get through? Louis would never miss my call. My eyelids twitched incessantly, and a sense of unease rose within me. Helpless, I turned to the system for assistance. It repeatedly asked me, "Are you sure?" By disrupting this crucial plot point, you will miss a chance to go back home and may even die. The cold, mechanical voice played like a haunting melody in my mind. I covered my ears and screamed in despair, "Tell me where he is." Only my desperate cries echoed through the hospital room. Bang! Doctors and nurses were drawn to the commotion, asking, "Tina, are you okay?" Finally, the system was willing to tell me Louis's whereabouts. Amidst the concerned gazes of others, I calmly stood up and said, "I'm fine." Chapter 20. Louis is currently suffering from John's revenge. I called the police. Instructed the driver to quickly head to the school gate. I was so nervous that my palms were covered in cold sweat. The college entrance examination was over, high school graduation had arrived. Fate wanted to bring the plot back on track. Did it know that I would have a last-minute change of heart and intentionally arranged for John's involvement? Is it that no matter what efforts I make, I cannot resist it? A tremendous sorrow engulfed me, crushing me mercilessly. The hanging amulet in the car swayed, seemingly expressing my helplessness. The usual journey to the school took about 20 minutes, but this time it only took 10. I hurriedly got out of the car, only to see John and others being taken away by the police. He glared at me with hatred, cursing loudly, "Tina, you wretched person." I glanced at him coldly and turned to walk into a secluded alley. There, lying in a pool of blood, was a person. He tried several times to stand up, but failed. His face was covered in blood, yet when he saw me, He smiled, revealing his white teeth. With great difficulty, he lifted his hand, showing me the plate of fried rice noodles he had protected. Louis. As I grabbed his hand, he stumbled into my embrace, whispering, "Tina, I didn't break my promise." He was drenched in blood, his whole body crimson. I wanted to hold him, but didn't know where to start. Chapter 21. Louis was rushed into the emergency room for treatment, while my grandmother's condition was also critical. Looking at the red light flashing outside the operating room, I painfully pounded my own head. Helplessness and anxiety engulfed me deeply. Susan appeared out of nowhere. She glanced in the direction of the operating room, her eyes bloodshot. "Tina, look at what you've done. You knew very well that Grandma was dying, and you knew that John might retaliate against Louis, yet you still asked him to buy fried rice noodles for you. Is this something a decent person would do?" The Susan questioning me at this moment didn't resemble the character from the book at all. Instead, she seemed to possess a god's perspective. The system had already told me that Susan might have also been transported into this world. We were both transmigrators, so why didn't I transmigrate into the female lead? She grabbed my collar and pulled me to the ground, as if about to hit me. I pushed her away with all my strength, and all my emotions erupted in that moment. Because I want to go home. If I don't follow the plot, it will be erased. Did I do something wrong? I just wanted to go home, that's all. But you shouldn't have been so malicious, so selfish. I weakly parted my lips, unable to argue. Yes, I was malicious, I was selfish. I would stop at nothing to achieve my goals. Even though I had tried my best to rectify this mistake, Louis still couldn't see our grandmother one last time. When he was wheeled out, Grandma's body was covered with a white sheet, also being pushed out. The two passed by each other, never to meet again in life or death. What can a malicious person like me do to atone for my sins? Chapter 22. Susan and I stayed by Louis' hospital room, waiting for him to wake up. The warm sunlight streamed in through the thin glass window, forming bright beams on the floor. Dust danced and leapt in the rays of light, light and agile. It should have been a warm day, but I felt icy cold, chilling to the bone. Louis fluttered his thick eyelashes and slowly opened his eyes. I called out to him with a hint of grievance, "Louis." But instead of the usual gentle touch on my forehead, he gave me a rare look of disgust. His words were sharp as a blade. "Tina, you murderer." I froze. The words "I didn't" got stuck in my throat, unable to come out. "Well, Tina, as you wished. Louis now hates you." Susan had a smug look on her face, pointing towards the door and saying, "Get lost. Someone as filthy as you doesn't deserve to be with us. We are the ones standing in the sunlight." Chapter 23. I don't know how I managed to leave the hospital room. Everything was spinning, and I felt dizzy. I leaned against the wall, painfully dry heaving. The system tried to comfort me. "Host, cheer up. You'll be able to go home soon." I should be happy. I'll be able to go home soon. I tried hard to lift the corners of my mouth, attempting to smile. But with every movement, the pain in my heart intensified. I slowly slid down the wall, sitting on the ground, and opened the cold fried rice noodles I had brought along. Mechanically, I finished eating them. Still, the food Louis made always tasted the best. Chapter 24. The original host's parents heard about the incident and returned from overseas. John was sentenced to prison. The original host's parents wanted to take me abroad with them. The system told me, "You can go now." I insisted on visiting Louis at the hospital every day. His eyes were filled with cold disgust whenever he looked at me. Each time, it felt like a living nightmare. The system tried to console me. When doing missions, you can't develop feelings for NPCs. Host, you've committed a grave mistake. But this time, let's consider it a lesson. On the day before leaving, I came to the hospital as usual. I pulled open the drawn curtains, allowing the warm sunlight to pour in and fill the entire room. Louis, with whom I had been cold for nearly a week, spoke up unexpectedly. "When are you leaving?" I was dumbfounded for a while before sluggishly uttering a date. "Tomorrow." I won't see you off then." Louis turned over, facing away from me, and hid under the covers. His voice sounded muffled. I stood still by the bed, silently watching his figure for a long time. In the depths of my heart, I silently said to him, "I'm sorry, farewell forever." Chapter 25. The next day, I carried my luggage and headed to the airport. As I boarded the plane, my heart felt empty, as if something was missing. The plane flew through the clouds for a while, suddenly encountering strong turbulence, shaking violently. There was a cacophony of noise around me, mixed with the terrified screams of passengers and the repeated announcements on the broadcast, trying to calm everyone down. The system said, "Host, it's time to go." I responded with a soft hum and closed my eyes. Completely detached from this body. To let the original host die in a plane crash, it was the best outcome. I didn't want another Tina to hurt Louis anymore. Chapter 26. Congratulations on coming home, host. After the system said those words, it disappeared. This body has been dormant for far too long. Many functions are almost on the verge of being useless. When I regained consciousness, my whole body felt weak and powerless. It took me a while to adjust before I slowly opened my eyes. Standing by the bed was a familiar and kind woman. She should have been young and beautiful, but now she looked like she had aged 10 years, exhausted. She held a damp towel in her hand, wiping my body. I blinked and took some time to focus my gaze, finally recognizing her face. Weakly, I called out to her, "Mom." The woman turned around to wring out the towel. Suddenly hearing my voice, she turned around in a panic, accidentally knocking over the basin of water. Hot water splashed all over her. However, she paid no attention to it, all her focus was on me. Seeing me wake up, she covered her mouth in surprise, tears instantly streaming down her face. While rushing out of the room, she shouted, "Doctor! Doctor, my daughter is awake." Chapter 27. I stayed in the hospital for a long period of time, undergoing rehabilitation and observation. My parents would come to see me every day. During the years I was in a coma, they had changed so much. My father's pale temples, my mother's weary expression, everything was enough to make my heart ache. My mother pushed me to the garden for a walk, telling me every detail of what had happened in these past years. Suddenly, our gaze was captivated by clusters of vibrant blooming roses. We stood there watching for a long time, as a white little puppy freely ran on the lawn, chasing butterflies. It was like a piece of candy. I heard from others that it was a stray dog from the neighborhood. My eyes welled up with tears instantly, and I pointed at the little puppy, asking, "Mom, can I keep it?" Mom readily agreed, saying, "Of course." She caught the little puppy and placed it in my arms. The puppy sniffed the scent on me, and once it was sure that I wouldn't harm it, it found a comfortable spot in my arms and peacefully fell asleep. My vision suddenly became blurry. The image of the little puppy gradually overlapped with the candy from years ago. For a moment, I could hardly distinguish between reality and illusion. I heard my mother's concerned voice in my ear, "Tina, why are you crying?" In an instant, my emotional defenses completely crumbled, and I held the puppy tightly, unable to speak through my sobs. As if sensing my sadness, the puppy clumsily licked the back of my hand, whimpering as if trying to comfort me. In my haze, I felt like I saw Louis. I asked him, "Louis, I've come home. Do you still have a home?"
Extra 1. Louis looked thin, sitting on the bed haphazardly wrapped in a blanket, his empty eyes staring at the ceiling. Susan kept talking to him incessantly. But he didn't hear a word, his mind long gone somewhere else. "Louis, let's apply to the same university when we fill out our college applications." This morning, a plane carrying 72 people crashed, and all passengers and crew members perished. The flight number was. Susan's voice and the TV sound overlapped. Louis suddenly looked up at the television. The camera had already switched to another scene, but all that echoed in his mind was the phrase. All perished. All perished. What about his Tina? Had she come home? Louis wasn't sure. His once calm and silent heart suddenly started to ache, from a slight pang to an all-encompassing pain that made him curl up. He collapsed onto the bed, like a bereaved beast, letting out a mournful cry. Susan was startled and exclaimed, "Louis, Louis." But Louis seemed deaf, unable to hear anyone's voice. All he knew was that this time, whether in the human world or in hell, he would never see his Tina again. He had lost her forever. That glimmer of light that belonged to him. collapsed in the leaking gas. The intense suffocating sensation made him gasp for breath, his face turning red. Yet, he held on to the amulet left by his grandmother, embracing Tina's photo, and smiled with relief. In this world, there was nothing left for him to care about. Instead of living like a walking corpse, it was better to become the free wind, the free clouds, and chase after the person he wanted to see. Tina was so cruel, not appearing in his dreams even once after being gone for so long. Was it because he was mean to her before? Was she still angry? If that was the case, then he would go find her instead. Louis pondered. He slowly closed his eyes. At that moment, it seemed like his soul detached from his physical body, becoming lighter and drifting into the sky. Where should he go? Where should he find his Tina? In the water, I yearn for you as I flow. In the fire, I miss you as I burn. Whether as a tail fish or as charcoal, my remaining life belongs to you. As he floated aimlessly, a beam of light broke through the clouds and gracefully descended. He heard Tina's whisper. Louis, I've come home. Do you still have a home? Wherever you are, my home is there. He responded with a whisper. When he opened his eyes again, he saw the person he had been longing for, holding a little dog that resembled Candy, sitting in a wheelchair. They gazed at each other from a distance, separated by a cluster of flowers. In Tina's mind, the voice of the system echoed one last time. Host, I have brought the male lead back to you.